Eleanor Sterling slammed the thick manila envelope onto the pristine frosting of Arthur's retirement cake, the heavy thud perfectly synchronized with the pop of confetti cannons fired by their adult children, Julian and Chloe. Arthur stood there, a 68-year-old chief financial officer holding a glass of lukewarm champagne, watching the woman he had bankrolled for 4 decades announce to a ballroom full of Boston's elite that her retirement gift to him was her own freedom. She wanted a divorce, half of his corporate pension, and the sprawling estate in Weston. Julian smirked, and Chloe raised her glass. They looked at Arthur not as a father, but as a vault that had just been cracked wide open. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't beg. He felt nothing but a cold, mathematical clarity. He simply wiped a smudge of vanilla icing off the legal documents, calmly uncapped his Mont Blanc fountain pen, and signed his name. As he handed the papers back to his beaming wife, Arthur leaned in and whispered 5 words she really should have listened to. "You just triggered the apocalypse." Before Eleanor could register the chilling tone of his voice, Arthur capped his pen, slipped it back into the inner pocket of his tailored suit, and turned his back on the ruined cake. The ballroom, echoing with the forced laughter of country club socialites and the clinking of crystal glasses, felt entirely alien to him. He navigated through the crowd of false smiles, his gaze fixed on the heavy double oak doors of the exit. He was ready to leave this toxic charade behind instantly. But his exit was not going to be that simple. Julian stepped directly into his path. His 35-year-old son puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of a velvet dinner jacket that Arthur had paid for. Julian held a glass of expensive scotch in one hand, sporting a grin that radiated unearned arrogance. "Going somewhere so soon, old man?" Julian asked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "Not so fast. Mother's lawyer made it very clear. Since you are leaving the marital home, you cannot take any marital assets with you. We do not want you draining the accounts out of spite before the judge officially freezes them. Hand them over." Arthur stopped and looked at his eldest child. He saw past the expensive haircut and the designer clothes. He remembered funding 3 separate business ventures for this boy, from a doomed craft brewery to a catastrophic cryptocurrency startup, all of which had burned to the ground because Julian refused to wake up before noon. Now, Julian stood there, acting as the muscle for his mother's greed, truly believing he was protecting his own inheritance. He thought wealth was just a static pile of gold waiting to be looted. He had no idea that Arthur was the heartbeat keeping that wealth alive. "The keys to the Mercedes?" Arthur asked, his voice deadpan. Julian laughed, glancing back at his mother who was watching with a triumphant gleam in her eye. "The keys to the house in Weston. And the credit cards. Give us the wallet. You can call a cab." Arthur reached into his trousers. He did not argue. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, the edges frayed from years of use. Inside were a black corporate card, a debit card, and perhaps $40 in cash. Arthur removed the cash, folded it neatly into his pocket, and slapped the leather wallet directly into his son's outstretched palm. "There is the liquidity," Arthur said flatly. Next, he retrieved the heavy brass key ring. It held the key to the massive front doors of the multi-million-dollar estate Eleanor cherished so deeply. He dropped the metal ring into Julian's hand. Julian closed his fist around the keys, his eyes shining with unchecked avarice. He thought he was holding ultimate power. He did not realize he was grasping the anchor that would drown him. "Have a nice walk, Dad," Julian sneered, stepping aside. "Do not worry about the money. We will take excellent care of it." Arthur walked out of the suffocating banquet hall and into the biting chill of the Boston night. The loud, celebratory noise of the party faded behind him, replaced by the howling wind sweeping off the harbor. Any observer walking past the hotel would have seen a pathetic figure, a man stripped of his home, his transportation, and his finances by a family of vultures. But Arthur did not feel pathetic. He checked his watch. It was exactly 8 o'clock. A sleek, black Lincoln Town car glided silently to the curb, its tires crunching softly against the frosty pavement. The rear window rolled down halfway, revealing the sharp, unsmiling face of Victor Vance. Victor was Arthur's personal attorney, the architect of the Sterling family's complex financial structures, and the only man in Boston who knew exactly where all the legal bodies were buried. Victor did not offer a greeting or a look of pity. He simply unlocked the door. Arthur slid into the spacious rear seat, the heavy door thudding shut and sealing away the freezing wind and the wreckage of his former life. The interior smelled of rich leather and quiet power. "Did she serve the papers?" Victor asked, his eyes meeting Arthur's in the rearview mirror. "She did," Arthur replied, leaning his head back against the headrest and closing his eyes. In front of everyone, Julian demanded the wallet and the keys. "They now have physical possession of the assets. And I signed the dissolution petition. The separation date is firmly established as of this minute." Victor nodded slowly, his fingers hovering over an encrypted tablet resting on his lap. "You understand the mechanics of this, Arthur. Once I execute the command, the protocols are strictly irreversible. The core assets within the irrevocable trust are designed to protect the principal investment against hostile legal action. If the primary beneficiary is compromised by a divorce petition, the liquidity dries up instantly. It is the nuclear auction." Arthur thought about Eleanor's radiant, cruel smile. He thought about Julian snatching the wallet. He thought about Chloe raising her glass to toast his humiliation. They desperately wanted the Sterling fortune. They wanted the lavish lifestyle, the country club memberships, and the endless shopping sprees. They simply did not understand that Arthur Sterling did not actually own any of those things. Arthur was merely the trustee, the manager of an aggressive corporate structure designed to ensure that this exact scenario would utterly destroy anyone who attempted to steal from it. "Do it," Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Shut it all down. Cancel every secondary card. Revoke all authorized user statuses. Notify the fleet management company to reclaim the vehicles and prepare the eviction notices for the Weston property." They wanted to play a ruthless game. "Let us show them what Major League pitching truly looks like." Victor tapped the screen. The tablet illuminated the dark cabin with a pale green light, displaying a processing bar that filled in seconds. The financial veins that had pumped lifeblood into his ungrateful family for decades were severed with a single digital keystroke. Arthur was not just cutting them off financially. He was erasing the artificial reality they had lived in for their entire lives. "Where to now?" Victor asked. "Take me to the Seaport District," Arthur commanded softly. "I have a small, private apartment under a holding company name. Nobody knows it exists. Tonight, I will sleep like a newborn. Tomorrow, the real education begins." As the Lincoln pulled away from the curb, Arthur did not look back at the Grand Hotel. He knew that inside, his family was likely ordering the most expensive vintage champagne on the menu, attempting to charge it to the black card resting in Julian's pocket. They were dancing wildly on the deck of a sinking ship, completely unaware that Arthur had just personally steered the iceberg directly into their path. The morning sun rose over Boston Harbor, reflecting brilliantly off the floor-to-ceiling windows of Arthur's secret apartment in the Seaport District. He woke up on a firm, unpretentious mattress, feeling a profound lightness he had not experienced in decades. He brewed a pot of black coffee, poured a simple cup, and sat down at the small glass dining table. He opened his encrypted laptop, navigating to the secure portal that controlled the surveillance feeds for the Weston estate. It was time for the first act of the new reality to unfold. Through the high-definition camera in the sprawling marble kitchen, the scene was one of absolute, oblivious triumph. Eleanor Sterling sat at the massive granite island, wrapped in a pure silk dressing gown, sipping a mimosa made with vintage champagne she had likely raided from Arthur's private cellar. Julian was nursing a mild hangover, scrolling lazily through his smartphone, while Chloe was busy angling her device to capture the perfect lighting for a social media post about her newly liberated family. They looked like royalty resting securely inside their fortress. They were completely unaware that the moat had been drained and the gates were already burning. The festive atmosphere shattered precisely at 9 o'clock. The front doorbell chimed, a melodic sound that echoed through the massive foyer. The security feed showed the manager of the luxury catering company from the previous night standing on the porch, clutching a wireless payment terminal. He looked deeply uncomfortable but resolute. Eleanor waved a hand dismissively, sending a housekeeper to open the door and escort the man directly into the kitchen. The manager cleared his throat, apologizing profusely for the early intrusion. He explained that a glitch had occurred during the final settlement of the bill at the hotel. The outstanding balance for the venue, the premium food, the staffing, and the open bar amounted to exactly $25,000. Eleanor laughed. It was a high, careless sound. She told the man not to worry about such trivial matters. She reached into her designer handbag and produced the heavy, metal corporate card, the primary lifeline she had utilized to fund her exorbitant lifestyle for years without ever once glancing at a price tag. She handed it to the manager with the regal air of a queen granting a simple favor. The manager inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, dissonant beep. He frowned, apologized, and tried the transaction a second time. Another angry beep echoed in the quiet kitchen. He looked at the digital screen and politely informed Eleanor that the card had been declined. Eleanor scoffed, her face flushing with sudden indignation. She insisted the limit on that account was virtually non-existent and ordered him to run it again. He did. The result remained unchanged. The error code on his screen did not indicate a lack of funds. It clearly stated that the account was closed. Julian puffed out his chest, stepping forward to play the role of the wealthy patriarch. He told his mother to relax, pulling out his own black card, the emergency line of credit Arthur had provided, which Julian exclusively used for bottle service at exclusive nightclubs. He handed it to the caterer with a smug grin. The machine beeped again. Declined. Julian's grin instantly vanished. Panic began to seep into the room like cold water seeping under a locked door. Chloe frantically dug into her purse, retrieving her card. She swiped it. Declined. The heavy silence in the kitchen was broken only by the manager, who was no longer smiling. He stated firmly that he required immediate payment, or he would be forced to contact the local Boston authorities to report a felony theft of services. Eleanor grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling violently as she dialed her aggressive divorce attorney, screaming into the receiver that Arthur was hiding assets and demanding an emergency court order to unfreeze her money. Arthur took a slow sip of his bitter coffee. The declined credit cards were merely the appetizer. The main course was currently arriving in the driveway. A notification flashed on Arthur's screen. Motion detected at the main gate. He switched the camera view to the exterior of the estate. Two massive, heavy-duty tow trucks were backing up the long gravel driveway, their yellow warning lights flashing ominously against the manicured hedges. They stopped precisely behind Julian's pristine Porsche and Chloe's customized Range Rover. Arthur watched as Julian sprinted out the front door, still wearing his expensive silk pajamas, waving his arms frantically. He rushed up to the closest tow truck driver, a burly man who looked entirely unimpressed by the frantic millionaire. Julian was screaming, jabbing his finger at the driver, undoubtedly demanding to know if the working-class man knew who he was. The driver calmly pulled a clipboard from his jacket and pointed to a specific line of text. The vehicles were not owned by Julian or Chloe. They were not even owned by Eleanor. They were leased strictly through the fleet management division of Arthur's former corporation. Arthur had personally drafted the lease agreements years ago. The contract contained a very specific clause stating that upon the termination of the primary officer's employment, all company vehicles were to be returned to the corporate fleet immediately. Since Arthur had officially retired and filed for legal separation in the exact same hour, the vehicle contracts were instantly voided. Julian tried to physically block the heavy steel chains from hooking onto the axle of his beloved sports car. The driver stepped forward, crossing his thick arms, delivering a stern, unspoken warning that sent Julian stepping backward in ultimate defeat. Chloe ran out next, holding her phone high, attempting to record the driver and threatening to destroy his towing company online with her vast army of followers. The driver completely ignored her tantrum, moving smoothly to hoist the heavy Range Rover high into the morning air. Eleanor stood frozen on the marble steps of the porch. She watched the tow trucks haul away the ultimate symbols of her children's status. She was holding her useless cell phone, realizing that the bank was entirely unreachable and her lawyer had no immediate solutions. The quiet man she had mocked for driving a modest sedan, the man she had discarded like absolute garbage the night before, was the only barrier that had ever stood between her and absolute ruin. And she had gleefully pushed him off the cliff. Arthur smiled, a cold and genuine expression of deep satisfaction. His ungrateful family was now stranded in a massive house with no cars, no credit, and zero cash. But they had not yet realized the most terrifying truth of all. They did not actually own the house, either. While the chaos of the declined credit cards and the repossessed luxury vehicles was still echoing outside in the grand driveway, a completely different delusion was unfolding deep inside the Weston estate. Arthur switched the security feed on his laptop to his former home office, a sanctuary of polished mahogany and dark leather that he had strictly forbidden anyone from entering for decades. Currently sitting behind Arthur's massive desk, with his feet propped up disrespectfully on the pristine wood, was Trent. Chloe's husband was a mediocre real estate agent who had sold exactly 2 modest homes in his entire 5-year career, both to distant relatives who took deep pity on him. Yet, at this moment, Trent was holding his smartphone, pacing the room with the swagger of a king who had just conquered a new empire. Arthur turned up the audio feed. Trent was shouting into the phone, his voice thick with unearned confidence, speaking to a shady developer friend. Trent bragged loudly that the listing for the sprawling Weston estate was going to be completely exclusive to him. He boasted about the immense square footage, the custom millwork, and how he planned to fast-track a cash sale to collect a massive double commission. He was already spending the non-existent money in his head, planning to upgrade his leased sedan to a luxury sports car. Trent genuinely believed that possession was the only law that mattered. He was about to learn that in Arthur Sterling's world, ironclad corporate paperwork was the absolute and only truth. The heavy, authoritative pounding on the solid oak front doors did not sound like a polite delivery or a friendly neighbor. Trent froze, hastily telling his friend he had to call back. He smoothed his suit jacket, checked his reflection in the glass of Arthur's framed diplomas, and strode out toward the grand foyer, fully expecting to greet a wealthy prospective buyer. Eleanor was already in the entryway, her face pale and her hands trembling from the humiliating confrontation with the catering manager. She pulled open the massive double doors. Standing on the wide stone porch was the local chief of police, a stern man Arthur had known for years. Directly beside the uniformed officer stood Victor Vance, looking like the Grim Reaper dressed in a flawless charcoal 3-piece suit, clutching a thick leather binder. Eleanor forced a fragile, nervous smile, her socialite reflexes attempting to take over. She asked if there was a problem with the vehicles, assuming this was all a terrible misunderstanding about the towed cars. The chief of police did not return her smile. He touched the brim of his hat and stated formally that he was there to officially escort Mr. Vance, who had urgent legal documents to serve regarding the occupancy of the premises. Trent pushed his way past his mother-in-law, trying to exert a pathetic display of alpha male dominance. He demanded to know what was going on, loudly proclaiming that this was private property and they could not simply barge in. Trent smugly pulled a glossy business card from his pocket and held it out to Victor, introducing himself as the exclusive listing agent for the marital estate. Victor looked at the card for a brief second and let it drop freely to the marble floor. He stepped over it and walked into the foyer, his leather shoes echoing sharply. He opened his thick binder and spoke with a voice that was calm, dry, and utterly destructive. Victor informed them that they were currently in direct violation of criminal trespass statutes. He stated clearly that the property located at this address was the sole asset of the Sterling Real Estate Holding Group, a direct subsidiary of the Sterling Family Trust. There was no listing agent, Victor explained coldly, because the property was absolutely not for sale. Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. She screamed that this was her house, yelling that she had picked out the expensive curtains and raised her children within these walls. She insisted her name was on the deed and that her divorce lawyer had assured her she possessed permanent rights until the settlement was finalized. Victor pulled a single document from the binder, protected by a clear plastic sleeve. The paper was yellowed with age. He held it up to the light. It was a residential lease agreement dated 25 years ago. He asked Eleanor if she recognized her own signature at the bottom of the page. Eleanor squinted at the paper, her jaw dropping as the color completely drained from her face. She remembered. Arthur had brought that exact document to her over 2 decades ago, casually mentioning it was a minor tax formality his accountants needed to depreciate the asset. She had signed it between sips of wine without reading a single clause. Victor read the terms aloud, ensuring his voice carried to the security cameras he knew Arthur was actively watching. The agreement stated that Arthur and Eleanor Sterling were merely tenants of the trust, renting the massive property for the sum of exactly $1 per year. However, a specific clause stated explicitly that the lease was entirely contingent upon the continuation of the legal marriage between the two tenants. Victor looked over his glasses at the trembling woman. He informed Eleanor that by filing the petition for dissolution of marriage the previous night, she had voluntarily and immediately terminated the qualifying condition of the lease. The contract was void the very second her lawyer filed the paperwork. Trent started shouting, claiming it was a trick and a massive fraud to hide marital assets. Victor smiled a cold, reptilian smile. He told Trent that the trust had purchased the land 5 years before Arthur had even met Eleanor. It was never marital property because it had never belonged to Arthur as an individual. Arthur was simply the caretaker of the trust. And now that the caretaker was removing himself due to his wife's legal action, the trust was violently reclaiming its asset. The chief of police stepped forward, holding an official eviction order signed by a superior court judge that very morning. He announced that the family had exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Trent argued desperately, claiming tenant laws protected them and demanding 30 days. Victor corrected him sharply. Since the lease was voided, they were no longer tenants. They were unauthorized intruders. The 48 hours was a generous courtesy, not a legal right. Then came the final, crushing blow. Victor looked around the extravagant foyer, gesturing to the crystal chandelier and the antique console tables. He informed them that the eviction order applied to the structure and all fixtures and furnishings owned by the trust. The expensive furniture, the fine art, the high-end electronics, and even the silver cutlery were all heavily cataloged corporate assets. The family was strictly allowed to remove their personal clothing and basic toiletries. Every single other item in the house stayed. Eleanor shrieked. She lunged forward, trying to rip the binder from Victor's hands. The chief of police intercepted her immediately, holding her back with a firm grip. He warned her in a low voice that assaulting an officer of the court would result in her immediate arrest, meaning she would spend her 48 hours in a concrete jail cell rather than packing her bags. Sitting in his quiet seaport apartment, Arthur closed the video feed. The guests had finally been asked to leave. They had lived in a breathtaking bubble of luxury, assuming the lifestyle was theirs by divine right, never once asking who actually owned the castle. The 48-hour countdown had officially begun, and the Sterling family was about to discover just how freezing the real world was without Arthur's checkbook to keep them warm. The air inside the Boston Superior Courtroom was stale and artificially chilled, precisely the environment Arthur preferred. It kept emotions frozen and logic paramount. However, the temperature at the plaintiff's table was rising rapidly due to the theatrical performance of Maxwell, the aggressive divorce attorney Eleanor had hired on contingency to skin Arthur alive. Eleanor refused to accept the reality of her eviction. She had marched into the city, flanked by Julian and Chloe, utterly convinced that a judge would see through Arthur's corporate shields and award her the millions she felt she inherently deserved. She sat dabbing her dry eyes with a lace tissue, playing the role of the devoted, abandoned matriarch perfectly. Maxwell paced furiously in front of the judge's bench. He pointed a dramatic finger at Arthur, who sat silently next to Victor Vance. Maxwell's voice boomed off the mahogany walls, accusing Arthur of blatant financial infidelity. He claimed Arthur had spent 40 years constructing a labyrinth of shell companies to defraud his loyal wife of her rightful marital assets. He demanded a full forensic audit, the immediate unfreezing of all accounts, and massive punitive damages for the emotional distress inflicted upon the Sterling family. Julian and Chloe smirked from the gallery. They truly believed Maxwell was winning. They thought the judge was buying the tragic narrative. The stern female judge looked over her glasses at the defense table. She asked Victor if his client had a response to these severe allegations of hiding assets. Victor did not stand immediately. He took a slow sip of water, adjusted his expensive cuffs, and rose with deliberate calmness. He did not walk to the center of the room. He simply reached beneath the heavy wooden table and hoisted a massive banker's box onto the surface with a loud thud. Victor stated softly that Mr. Maxwell was partially correct. There were indeed millions of dollars no longer accessible to Mrs. Sterling and her children. However, Victor clarified coldly, the allegation that Arthur had hidden them was entirely false. Arthur had not hidden a single dime. Victor opened the box and pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume. He walked to the bench and handed the book to the judge, then handed a duplicate copy to a very confused Maxwell. Victor announced to the court that the volume was a 10-year forensic accounting of the discretionary spending of the Sterling family. He explained that Arthur was a man of meticulous records. Every swipe of a corporate credit card, every wire transfer, and every cash withdrawal made by his wife and children over the last decade had been categorized and archived. Eleanor stopped dabbing her eyes. Her posture stiffened in sheer panic. Victor turned to the gallery. He stated that the plaintiffs claimed they were cut off from their fair share, but the defense argued they had already consumed their share with a gluttony bordering on the pathological. Victor opened his notes and began reading the devastating figures aloud. He listed Eleanor first. Over the last 10 years, she had charged nearly $2 million to the trust for couture clothing and jewelry, plus hundreds of thousands on experimental wellness retreats. Next was Julian. Victor read the staggering losses from the trust financing Julian's 6 separate business ventures. A failed craft brewery. A collapsed cryptocurrency firm. A luxury sneaker app that never launched. Victor looked directly at Julian in the gallery and stated that the total capital completely destroyed by the eldest son was over $1 million, not including his exorbitant travel expenses. Julian shrank into his seat, his arrogant smirk entirely gone. Finally, Victor detailed Chloe's records. He exposed hundreds of thousands in credit card debt for luxury hotels and professional photographers to fund her social media presence. He noted that her official tax returns showed a net income of practically zero, proving the trust had been entirely subsidizing her fake online life. Victor closed his folder. He told the judge that Arthur did not hide the assets. He simply sat back and watched his family eat them. Maxwell was sweating profusely. He stammered, loosening his tie, arguing that even if the figures were accurate, it was an established marital lifestyle, and the marriage ended the moment Eleanor filed the paperwork. Arthur finally stood up. He did not need a microphone. His voice commanded the room with the practiced authority of a chief financial officer. Arthur informed the judge that his father had established the master charter of the Sterling Investment Trust with a very specific fail-safe. He cited the recoupment clause. Arthur explained that the clause was written to ensure the family fortune would never be squandered by greed. He looked dead into Eleanor's terrified eyes. Arthur stated that in the exact event of a divorce initiated by the beneficiary's spouse, any funds spent by the spouse and adult children in excess of a standard cost of living index were retroactively reclassified. They were no longer considered gifts. They instantly became personal debt owed directly to the trust. Eleanor gasped, clutching the edge of the table. She finally understood the magnitude of her colossal mistake. Arthur declared to the silent courtroom that he was not hiding assets. He was officially calling in the loan. He stated that his family did not merely possess zero assets. They legally owed the Sterling Trust $5 million. And as the sole trustee, Arthur was initiating collection proceedings effective immediately. The courtroom erupted. Eleanor screamed at Maxwell to do something. Julian tried to bolt from the gallery, but the bailiff blocked the door. Chloe burst into hysterical tears. The judge slammed her gavel, demanding order. She carefully reviewed the ironclad trust documents Victor had provided. Finding the legal architecture flawless, she denied every single one of Eleanor's motions. The judge dismissed the case entirely and coldly advised Eleanor's lawyer to help his clients prepare for immediate bankruptcy. Maxwell slammed his briefcase shut. He glared at Eleanor with pure disgust, furious that she had lied to him about the true nature of their finances. He told her she was on her own and stormed out of the courtroom. Arthur walked past his ruined family without a single glance. They had confidently marched into court hunting for a massive payout. They were leaving with a $5 million bill, absolutely crushed under the weight of their own historic greed. The catastrophic downfall of the Sterling dynasty did not culminate in a grand marble foyer or a corporate boardroom. It happened in a cramped beige interior of the Starlight Motel on the dreary outskirts of Boston. It was a place where the thin sheets smelled heavily of industrial bleach and lingering regret. Sitting comfortably in his quiet seaport penthouse, Arthur poured himself a glass of sparkling water and opened a secure audio file on his encrypted laptop. His private investigator had successfully planted a tiny listening device inside the lining of Eleanor's last remaining designer handbag during the chaotic eviction process. She clutched that bag like a physical lifeline, entirely unaware that it was broadcasting the absolute destruction of her family directly to the man she had tried to ruin. Arthur listened to the raw, unfiltered audio of the pressure cooker finally exploding. The family had been forced into two small adjoining motel rooms, their entire lives violently shoved into black plastic garbage bags because they could not afford cardboard moving boxes. The paper-thin walls offered zero privacy. The recording started with Trent. Chloe's husband had been frantically pacing the stained carpet for hours, desperately calling his shady contacts and second-rate lawyers, searching for a miraculous legal loophole to save his lifestyle. He found absolutely nothing. Instead, Trent found the terrifying truth about the woman he had married. His voice crackled through the audio feed, shrill and dripping with panic. He was screaming at Chloe. He demanded to know the truth about the secret trust fund she had constantly bragged about while they were dating. He demanded to see the inheritance she had firmly promised him existed. Chloe was sobbing hysterically. Her voice was weak and pathetic. She tearfully admitted that she had lied about everything just to get him to propose. She confessed that her entire net worth was tied exclusively to a corporate credit card that was currently cut into useless pieces on the cheap motel nightstand. The devastating reality was that she was completely broke and legally tied to a $5 million debt owed to her own father. The sharp sound of a suitcase zipper cutting through the argument echoed in Arthur's quiet apartment. Trent was not staying to work through the hardship. He was not honoring his wedding vows for better or for worse. He had married for richer, and now that they had violently crashed into poorer, he was permanently checking out. Trent yelled that he was immediately filing for an annulment based on extreme financial fraud. He called his weeping wife a useless parasite. He told Chloe she was a manipulative gold digger who was exactly like her greedy mother. He grabbed his bags and marched out of the motel room, slamming the hollow wooden door so hard the cheap hinges rattled. Chloe wailed loudly. It was the agonizing sound of a woman realizing that her internet fame, her carefully curated beauty, and her thousands of followers meant absolutely nothing when the nightly rent was due. However, the departure of Trent was merely the opening act of the hostility. While Chloe cried on the edge of a sagging mattress, the rest of the family turned on each other like starving wolves locked in a cage. The polished veneer of their high society affection dissolved entirely, replaced by venomous accusations. Julian stormed into the room, his voice shaking with absolute rage. He pointed a trembling finger at his mother. He demanded to know why she had to stage a public coup at the retirement party. He screamed at Eleanor, asking why she had not bothered to hire a competent accountant to review the trust structures before throwing the divorce papers onto the frosting of the cake. He yelled that she had single-handedly destroyed their entire future for a brief moment of dramatic satisfaction. Eleanor shrieked back at her son, her voice raspy and hysterical. She tried to defend her colossal stupidity, claiming she thought 50 years of marriage automatically meant she owned half of the empire. She yelled that Julian was just as guilty, reminding him that he had eagerly clapped and cheered for the divorce while dreaming of buying a new sports car with the settlement money. She called him an ungrateful failure who had flushed $1 million of Arthur's hard-earned money down the drain on terrible business ideas. Julian kicked a cheap wooden chair, sending it crashing violently against the thin motel wall. He blamed Eleanor for raising them in a complete financial fantasy. Chloe stopped crying just long enough to scream at Julian, blaming him for draining the corporate account so recklessly that Arthur had to institute the ironclad repayment clauses in the first place. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the water in his glass. He listened as the Sterling family tore themselves apart. They were desperately trying to shift the crushing weight of the blame, refusing to accept that they were all equal participants in their own demise. They had spent decades treating Arthur like a silent bank teller, an endless well of cash to be exploited. They never once considered the intricate architecture of the dam that held back the brutal floodwaters of reality. By serving him those divorce papers, Eleanor had blown up the dam with dynamite. Now they were all drowning together in the murky water, desperately pushing each other under in a futile attempt to catch a single breath of air. Arthur closed the audio file. The silence in his apartment was beautiful. The Sterling family bond was completely shattered, proving that without his money holding them together, they were nothing but strangers united only by their mutual greed. The heavy burden of their toxic existence was no longer his cross to bear. Let them fight over the ashes of the empire they had willfully burned to the ground. The suffocating walls of the Starlight Motel were closing in rapidly on Julian Sterling. While Chloe wept bitterly over her annulment in the adjoining room, Julian faced a completely different kind of marital reckoning. His wife, Megan, sat on the edge of the stained mattress, staring at a cheap vending machine dinner with absolute disgust. She was a woman who believed the world owed her a lavish living simply for existing. She had married Julian for the pristine Weston estate and the unlimited black cards, not for a life of poverty in a room that smelled intensely of mildew and bleach. Megan turned her venomous gaze toward Julian. She whispered that Arthur was purely evil, twisting reality until Julian was the helpless victim of a grand theft rather than the ungrateful beneficiary of decades of unearned generosity. She reminded Julian about the massive overflow warehouse at Sterling Medical Supply. It was a primary distribution facility Arthur had managed meticulously for over 20 years, housing millions of dollars in high-value electronics, medical-grade tablets, and restricted corporate hardware. Megan coldly told Julian that since his last name was Sterling, those goods technically belonged to him by right of blood. She instructed him to go there in the middle of the night, take a truckload of merchandise, and fence the goods in the city. She claimed they could get enough untraceable cash to hire a competent, ruthless lawyer who could finally break the trust and defeat Arthur in court. Julian hesitated, his voice trembling as he admitted he did not have a security key and the perimeter was incredibly tight. Megan mocked his hesitation relentlessly. She questioned his manhood, asking if he was going to let his aging father starve them to death in a roadside motel. She manipulated his fragile ego with the precision of a surgeon until only his desperate greed and wounded pride remained. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Arthur's encrypted smartphone vibrated silently on the glass nightstand in his seaport penthouse. It was not a phone call. It was a high-priority notification from the automated security grid at the main Sterling Logistics warehouse. The alert indicated a perimeter breach in Sector 4. Arthur did not panic. He calmly rose from his bed, walked into the pristine kitchen, and poured himself a hot cup of Earl Grey tea. He carried the steaming porcelain cup to his dark mahogany desk and opened his laptop. He accessed the live security portal with a few swift keystrokes. The video feed was grainy night vision, but the intruding figure was unmistakably clear. It was Julian. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt, awkwardly trying to pry open an old steel service door with a heavy iron crowbar. He looked absolutely terrified. He looked incredibly clumsy. He was foolishly attempting to break into a corporate fortress that Arthur had spent 40 years fortifying against professional criminals. Julian managed to pop the rusted lock and slipped inside the cavernous building. Arthur switched the camera views, tracking his son's movements perfectly. Julian walked down the towering aisles, shining a weak flashlight over pallets of expensive corporate tablets and specialized medical monitors. He grabbed a cardboard box, tearing it open aggressively. He started stuffing the high-end electronics into a large canvas duffel bag, his face twisted in a mask of entitled concentration. He genuinely believed he was merely reclaiming his stolen inheritance. Julian had absolutely no idea that the exact moment he breached the exterior door, a silent alarm had tripped. He did not know that the warehouse was equipped with a state-of-the-art pressure-sensitive floor system that tracked his every single footstep in real time. And he certainly did not realize that the elite security contract Arthur had signed 5 years ago guaranteed a police response time of under 4 minutes. Arthur took a slow, thoughtful sip of his hot tea, watching the digital screen as intense blue and red lights began to flash silently against the high, frosted warehouse windows. Julian was completely oblivious. He turned a corner, carrying the heavy bag full of stolen corporate property, and walked straight into a blinding wall of tactical flashlights. Arthur watched through the crystal-clear audio feed as heavily armed police officers ordered Julian to get on the ground. Julian dropped the heavy duffel bag in pure shock. He raised his trembling hands in the air, shielding his eyes from the intense glare. A massive officer stepped forward, shoving Julian forcefully against the cold concrete floor, pressing his arrogant face deep into the industrial dust. Julian began crying frantically. He screamed at the top of his lungs that his last name was Sterling. He yelled desperately that his father owned the entire corporation and that he had explicit permission to be inside the building to collect his personal items. The arresting officers did not care about his last name or his pathetic excuses. They pulled his arms roughly behind his back, securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. They formally read him his Miranda rights as they hauled him to his feet. They dragged Julian out of the massive warehouse and tossed him roughly into the back of a waiting police cruiser, the heavy doors slamming shut on his freedom. Arthur set his teacup down on the desk. He felt no pity. He felt no remorse. Julian was no longer a spoiled heir playing a silly game. He was a common burglar caught dead to rights, attempting to steal from the very legacy he had been far too lazy to help build. The trap had worked flawlessly, and the brutal reality of the criminal justice system was about to give Julian the harsh education he so desperately needed. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning when the encrypted smartphone resting on Arthur Sterling's mahogany desk began to vibrate, shattering the profound silence of his seaport penthouse. The caller ID glowed brightly in the dim room, displaying a number he did not immediately recognize, but he knew exactly who was on the other end. He let the device buzz 3 separate times, savoring the quiet control he held over the situation, before he finally swiped the screen to answer. Arthur did not offer a greeting. He simply brought the phone to his ear and waited. A raw, hysterical scream erupted from the speaker. It was Eleanor. Her voice was entirely stripped of its usual country club polish, reduced to the guttural, frantic wail of a woman whose carefully constructed reality was currently disintegrating into dust. She shrieked his name, calling him a heartless monster. She sobbed violently, explaining that Megan had just called her from the miserable motel room. Megan had received his one allotted phone call from the central holding facility of the Boston Police Department. Julian had been formally booked. The authorities were charging their eldest son with grand larceny, breaking and entering, and criminal trespassing on a highly secure commercial property. Eleanor screamed that Julian was facing up to 5 years in a state penitentiary. She demanded to know how Arthur could sit back and allow this tragedy to happen to his own flesh and blood. She accused him of knowing about the trap, insisting that since he controlled the security grid, he had the supreme power to stop the arrest before it ever took place. Arthur took a slow, deep breath. The sheer magnitude of her entitlement was breathtaking. Even now, after being evicted, bankrupted, and exposed in a court of law, Eleanor fundamentally believed it was Arthur's absolute duty to cushion their every fall. She genuinely believed that his permanent role in life was to serve as the eternal safety net, blindly catching his family members no matter how recklessly or deliberately they jumped off the cliff. Arthur spoke, his voice steady, quiet, and as cold as absolute zero. He corrected her immediate assumption. He stated clearly that he did not force their 35-year-old son to drive to a commercial logistics center in the middle of the night. He did not hand Julian a heavy iron crowbar. He did not instruct his son to shatter a lock and stuff thousands of dollars worth of corporate electronics into a canvas bag. Eleanor yelled back, her panic mutating into desperate rage. She claimed Julian was starving and terrified. She blamed Arthur for cutting off their funds so abruptly, arguing that his financial cruelty had driven their boy to absolute desperation. She insisted that this entire criminal ordeal was entirely Arthur's fault. Arthur remained completely unmoved by her emotional manipulation. He told Eleanor that Julian's predicament was not the result of poverty. It was the direct, catastrophic result of 30 years of never hearing the word no. He reminded her that Julian was a grown man, and grown men must navigate the consequences of their own deliberate choices. Tonight, Arthur explained, Julian actively chose to become a felon. Eleanor reverted instantly to the commanding, arrogant tone she used when scolding the hired help at her former estate. She ordered Arthur to fix it. She demanded that he immediately telephone the chief of police, a man he played golf with at the country club, and declare the entire incident a massive misunderstanding. She ordered him to tell the authorities that Julian had executive permission to remove inventory from the warehouse. She demanded he drop all corporate charges instantly and bring their son home. Arthur listened to her frantic commands, letting a heavy, suffocating silence hang on the line for several long seconds. He asked her a very simple question. He asked her what she would do if he refused. He asked if she would file for divorce again, or perhaps threaten to take away his house. He reminded Eleanor that she had already fired every single bullet in her legal and emotional arsenal. She was currently clicking on an entirely empty chamber. Eleanor fell silent. Only her heavy, ragged breathing echoed through the receiver. Arthur leaned forward in his leather chair, preparing to deliver the final, crushing lesson. He reminded Eleanor of the spectacular speech she had given at the retirement party. He recalled how she had stood in front of hundreds of wealthy guests and proudly announced to the entire world that she was entirely done with him. She had demanded her absolute independence. She had craved to be totally liberated from his financial and marital control. Arthur told her that this exact moment was what true freedom looked like. He explained that freedom was not simply a blank check to do whatever one desired without consequence. True freedom inherently included the terrifying liberty to fail miserably. It included the absolute obligation to face the severe legal and personal consequences of one's own profound stupidity. Without the massive shield of the Sterling family trust to protect them, the harsh physics of the real world finally applied to their actions. Arthur stated that Julian was now completely free. He was free to navigate the complex criminal justice system on his own. He was free to request a public defender because he could not afford a private attorney. And Eleanor, Arthur added coldly, was completely free to figure out exactly how to post a massive cash bail without access to a single credit card. Eleanor began to whimper, her arrogance finally shattering under the unbearable weight of the truth. She pleaded with him, whispering that Julian was his son. Arthur agreed. He stated that Julian was his son when he paid for his elite private university tuition. Julian was his son when he funded 3 separate, disastrous business ventures. Julian was his son when he offered him a legitimate executive position that Julian refused to show up for. But tonight, Arthur declared, the man in that holding cell was not acting as his son. Tonight, he was an unauthorized burglar who had maliciously broken into a secure corporate facility owned by the trust. And the trust, Arthur finalized, always presses maximum charges to protect its assets. Arthur lowered the phone and ended the call. He did not block her number. He wanted Eleanor to attempt to call back. He wanted her to listen to the phone ring endlessly, forcing her to fully realize that the deafening silence on his end was a deliberate, permanent choice. He looked at the digital clock on his computer screen. The trap had closed perfectly. Julian Sterling would face the morning light not as a wealthy heir, but as a documented criminal, formally stripped of his untouchable status and forced to survive entirely on his own merit. The Boston Heritage Club was a formidable fortress of old money and vicious new gossip. For 30 years, Arthur Sterling had walked these heavily manicured grounds as a mere shadow. He was simply Eleanor's husband, the silent wallet with legs, the man who quietly paid the astronomical membership dues while his wife drank expensive vodka tonics with women who secretly despised her. To the elite members, Arthur was a boring utility bill. To Eleanor, he was an accessory. But tonight, the dynamic was entirely rewritten. The annual Autumn Charity Gala was the undisputed highlight of the Boston social season. This was the exact event Eleanor lived for. It was the night she would wear a gown she could not truly afford, drink champagne she did not pay for, and hold court with the absolute elite. But Eleanor was not on the guest list tonight. Her name had been ruthlessly scrubbed from the registry the moment her personal check for the auxiliary dues had bounced weeks ago. Arthur did not arrive through the side entrance. He pulled up to the grand portico in his sleek black Lincoln. He stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of a bespoke tuxedo that fit his frame perfectly. He reached his hand back into the vehicle, gently assisting Dr. Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn was a professor of architectural history at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She wore a simple, breathtakingly elegant emerald gown. She possessed silver hair tied in a sophisticated knot and a sharp, intellectual gaze that commanded immediate respect. She did not need Arthur's money. She was a woman of true substance, entirely independent, standing beside him as an absolute equal. Across the city, in a completely different universe, Eleanor Sterling was sitting on a plastic chair inside the bleak, fluorescent-lit break room of a massive discount supermarket. She was wearing a blue polyester vest over a cheap white shirt, her name tag slightly crooked. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were rough and dry from scanning endless barcodes during her grueling night shift. She clutched her cracked smartphone, her tired eyes glued to the screen. She had found the live stream of the Boston Heritage Club Gala on a local society page. She watched in absolute horror as Arthur and his stunning new partner confidently entered the grand ballroom. The conversation in the ballroom did not stop when Arthur entered, but the entire frequency shifted. Heads turned abruptly. Whispers ignited like dry brush catching fire. The viper pit of Eleanor's former best friends huddled together, clutching their crystal flutes. They had fully expected to see a broken, defeated man mourning the scandalous loss of his family. Instead, they saw a man who looked 10 years younger, radiating the easy, dominant confidence of a king who had successfully defended his castle. Arthur and Evelyn took their seats at the head table. The club president tapped his glass, bringing the massive room to a hushed silence. He introduced Arthur not as the boring accountant they all remembered, but as the new honorary chairman of the philanthropic board. Arthur stood up and walked steadily to the podium. The bright spotlight hit him. He looked out at the sea of faces, the very people who had ignored his existence for decades. He saw the naked greed and curiosity in their eyes. In the brutal calculus of their shallow world, Arthur was the undeniable winner, and they all wanted to bask in his victory. He spoke into the microphone, his voice smooth and commanding. He thanked the crowd for their hospitality over the years. He announced that he had recently entered a brand new phase of life, a retirement that had proven remarkably eventful. He paused, letting the silence stretch, knowing exactly who might be watching through a glowing screen miles away. Arthur stated that during his recent legal proceedings, his former attorneys had calculated a very specific sum of money. It was the exact amount that would have been aggressively demanded for a divorce settlement to maintain a lavish lifestyle that frankly no longer existed. He explained that since that settlement was no longer legally required due to the activation of certain preservation clauses, he found himself with a massive surplus of liquidity. Rather than letting that capital sit stagnant in a bank vault, he decided to invest it in a cause that truly appreciated in value. A large presentation check was carried out onto the stage by two assistants. The bold black numbers written across the surface were impossible to miss. Arthur proudly announced that the Sterling Investment Trust was officially donating exactly $5 million to the Urban Youth Entrepreneurship Program. The crowd gasped in unison. It was an astronomical sum. It was also the exact amount of money Eleanor and her children currently owed the trust. Arthur looked directly into the lens of the videographer documenting the event. He stated firmly that it was his deepest hope this money would teach the next generation the immense value of earning their keep. He declared that giving people money they did not earn never helps them, it absolutely destroys them. The applause was thunderous. The entire ballroom rose to their feet for a massive standing ovation. Eleanor's former best friends were clapping the hardest, sporting fake smiles while their eyes darted around in pure panic. They all fully understood the message. Arthur had just taken the ultimate prize Eleanor believed was her absolute salvation, and he had literally given it away to strangers on live television. He had publicly incinerated her golden parachute. In the depressing supermarket break room, Eleanor dropped her cracked phone onto the sticky laminate table. A single sob tore through her throat. The realization crushed her lungs. She was not just completely bankrupt. She was entirely irrelevant. Arthur had brilliantly stripped her of the one single thing she valued far more than money. He had obliterated her social status. She could never show her face in Boston elite society ever again, not because she lacked the funds, but because she was now the ultimate punchline of a $5 million joke. She was the arrogant woman who walked away from an empire and received nothing but an eviction notice and a polyester vest. Arthur walked off the stage, shaking hands and accepting endless congratulations. He ordered a scotched mead, clinked his glass gently against Evelyn's champagne flute, and took a slow, satisfying sip. The air in the ballroom tasted incredibly clean. He had not just punished his former wife. He had permanently erased her from his history. 6 months is a relatively brief period in the realm of high finance, but it is an absolute eternity in the grinding world of minimum wage labor. Sitting in his penthouse overlooking the gray waters of the Boston Harbor, Arthur Sterling opened a secure video file sent by his private investigator. It was not cruelty that compelled him to watch. It was strict due diligence. He needed to verify if the severe lesson had been fully absorbed. The first file documented Eleanor. She was standing behind a register at the exact same discount supermarket on the edge of the city. She was wearing a blue vest that hung awkwardly on her shrinking frame. Her hair, once maintained flawlessly at exclusive salons, now revealed prominent roots of steel gray. She was mechanically scanning heavy bags of dog food. The humiliation was absolute and ongoing. The camera zoomed in on her hands. The sparkling diamond rings were completely gone, sold months ago to pay for basic groceries and rent for a squalid 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her children. Her nails were chipped and bare. She looked exhausted, defeated, and deeply aged. Arthur opened the next file. It was a series of crisp photographs taken outside a pawn shop in a rough neighborhood. The subject was Chloe. His youngest daughter, the former social media influencer who used to post lavish unboxing videos of luxury goods, was now doing the heartbreaking boxing. She was standing at the scuffed counter, aggressively arguing with a pawnbroker behind thick bulletproof glass. On the counter sat a pristine designer handbag, a graduation gift Arthur had purchased for $12,000. The audio file attached to the photos captured Chloe pleading, desperately claiming the bag was a timeless investment piece. The broker offered her $800. Chloe screamed that it was pure robbery, grabbed the bag, and stormed out, only to stop on the dirty sidewalk, check her overdrawn bank balance on a shattered phone screen, and slowly walk back inside to accept the insulting cash offer. Then there was Julian. Arthur clicked the third file. Julian had avoided state prison by pleading down to a severe misdemeanor, but the felony arrest record remained an impenetrable barrier to any corporate employment. He had applied to banks, hedge funds, and consulting firms, relying foolishly on the Sterling name to open doors. But the Sterling name was now synonymous with Arthur's ruthless liquidation and Julian's pathetic burglary. No one would hire him. The video showed Julian sitting on a dusty curb, eating a cold sandwich wrapped in cheap wax paper. He was wearing heavy work boots and denim stained with white paint. He had finally secured work as a day laborer on a brutal construction crew, a job he obtained solely because the foreman paid in cash and asked zero questions. Julian, the arrogant heir who had once complained that his executive office chair lacked proper lumbar support, was now hauling heavy sheets of drywall up 4 flights of stairs for $15 an hour. His soft, manicured hands were completely covered in raw, bleeding blisters. That evening, the three of them converged. They did not meet at the country club or a 5-star restaurant. They gathered in a cramped, poorly lit living room of Eleanor's cheap apartment. Arthur tapped into the audio feed from the tiny listening device his investigator had planted behind the radiator weeks prior. The mood was incredibly grim. They were eating greasy takeout pizza from a cardboard box. Eleanor complained bitterly that her veins were popping from standing all day. Julian snapped back, pointing out his bleeding hands and screaming that a man with a prestigious business degree should not be taking orders from a high school dropout on a construction site. Chloe sobbed that she had nothing left to sell and that her social media accounts were completely dead. They sat in heavy silence, chewing the terrible food. They were utterly miserable. But then, the conversation abruptly shifted. It did not shift toward genuine remorse or self-reflection. It shifted toward a highly calculated strategy. Eleanor spoke quietly, her voice gaining a sudden, manipulative strength. She told her children that Arthur had to be incredibly lonely. She reasoned that a 68-year-old man living by himself after 40 years of marriage could not simply turn off his emotions. She convinced them that Arthur was merely waiting for them to break, waiting for them to come crawling back and beg for his ultimate forgiveness. Julian sounded skeptical, asking what would happen if Arthur just laughed in their faces. Eleanor countered smoothly, arguing they had absolutely nothing left to lose. But if he cracked, she whispered, they would immediately regain the Weston estate, the luxury cars, and the unlimited black cards. She formulated the entire plot. They just had to swallow their pride for one single afternoon. They would go to his seaport penthouse. They would cry. They would swear they missed him and tell him they had finally learned the true value of a hard-earned dollar. They simply needed to play the perfect part of the prodigal family. Chloe agreed eagerly, stating she could easily produce authentic tears and promising to wear a modest, cheap dress with zero makeup to look truly broken. Julian nodded, deciding he would show Arthur his calloused hands and pretend he now respected blue-collar grit, knowing Arthur admired hard work above all else. Eleanor smiled. It was the terrifying ghost of her old, predatory smile. She finalized the plan, stating they would arrive the very next afternoon and refused to leave until Arthur signed a massive check. They just needed to stroke his ego and make him believe they were entirely reformed. Arthur listened to them plotting their elaborate heist. They were constructing a fictional script based on a soft, forgiving version of him that had died the moment Eleanor threw the divorce papers onto his retirement cake. They genuinely thought they were dealing with a lonely, sentimental father. They were actually dealing with a ruthless chairman of the board. And when a fraudulent proposal is brought to the chairman, the board does not grant funding. The board calls security. Arthur closed the audio feed, a cold smile forming on his lips. They were walking straight into a trap that would test exactly how much their fake humility was truly worth. The private elevator that serviced the top floor of the premier seaport residential tower utilized biometric security and ascended with the absolute silence of a predator stalking its prey. Arthur Sterling stood near the center of his expansive foyer, his hands clasped casually behind his back, waiting for the polished steel doors to slide open. He had intentionally leaked his current address to a mutual acquaintance who was notoriously incapable of keeping a secret, knowing the information would reach Eleanor within hours. They fully expected to find him residing in a depressing assisted living facility or a gloomy apartment smelling of old coffee and deep regret. They anticipated a broken, lonely man staring blankly at a television screen. When the elevator doors finally parted, Eleanor, Julian, and Chloe did not step into a nursing home. They stepped onto pristine Italian marble imported directly from Carrara. They entered a breathtaking space boasting 20-foot ceilings and a panoramic view of the Boston Harbor that stretched endlessly toward the Atlantic Ocean. The late afternoon sunlight flooded the magnificent apartment, turning the floating dust motes into sparkling gold. Arthur watched them freeze in their tracks. It was a pathetic tableau of highly calculated humility. Eleanor wore a dull gray wool coat that appeared 3 sizes too large, a garment she had likely excavated from a discount thrift bin. Her face was scrubbed entirely clean of cosmetics, fully revealing the deep wrinkles she had previously spent a small fortune attempting to conceal. Behind her stood Julian and Chloe, dressed immaculately in what Arthur could only categorize as poverty cosplay. Julian wore a faded flannel shirt and heavy work boots that were scuffed with genuine construction dust. Chloe wore a severely plain cotton dress, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. They looked like tragic refugees, entirely ready to attend the funeral of Arthur's pride. Eleanor was the very first to recover from the shock of the overwhelming luxury. Her eyes darted frantically around the massive room, absorbing the grand piano and the intimidating expanse of the square footage. She was instantly realizing that while she was scanning dog food for minimum wage, the man she discarded was living in a fortress of absolute wealth. She took a hesitant step forward, reaching her hands out. Her voice trembled with a meticulously rehearsed fragility. She whispered his name, claiming the profound guilt had been eating them alive. She delivered her rehearsed line flawlessly, claiming they now understood that unearned money was pure poison. Julian stepped up right beside his mother and dropped his knees directly onto the cold marble floor. His voice cracked with theatrical emotion. He held up his calloused hands, telling his father that the grueling construction job had completely broken his arrogance. He swore he finally understood what it meant to truly work. He begged to just have his father back. Chloe immediately joined her brother, kneeling gracefully and dropping her head to play the ultimate role of the submissive, repentant daughter. She squeezed out large, silent tears that rolled down her pale cheeks. She sobbed that she did not care about designer bags anymore, claiming she only wanted to be a real family again. Arthur looked down at them. They were three desperate actors performing on a magnificent stage for an audience of one. If he had not listened to their scheming conversation the night before, he might have actually believed the severe hardship had cracked their selfish shells. But Arthur knew the absolute truth. He knew this was a coordinated heist. They were not kneeling for forgiveness. They were kneeling for the combination to the bank vault. He unclasped his hands and gestured smoothly toward the sunken living room. He kept his voice perfectly neutral, instructing them to stand up and sit on the sofas. They scrambled to their feet instantly, a sudden spark of greedy hope flaring in their eyes. They treaded softly into the living room and sat huddled together on the edge of a sprawling white leather sofa. Arthur walked over to a sidebar, poured a glass of sparkling water, and sat in a plush armchair directly opposite them. Resting exactly in the center of the glass coffee table was a thick, navy blue legal folder. It was bound tightly with a gold elastic cord. The Stark label on the front was typed in bold lettering. It read Sterling Investment Trust Restoration and Reinstatement Protocol. Eleanor locked her eyes onto the folder. She actually stopped breathing for a brief second. Her gaze was ravenous. To the three of them, that folder was not merely paper. It was a magical time machine designed to transport them straight back to the country club and the luxury cars. Arthur leaned forward, resting his hand gently on top of the blue folder. The room went completely silent. He looked at Julian and calmly stated that living in the quiet isolation of the penthouse had given him new perspective. He lied beautifully, stating he realized his sudden financial cutoff was perhaps too traumatic of a shock. Eleanor let out a loud, theatrical sob of pure relief. Arthur continued, stating that simply abandoning them did not solve the underlying problem. They desperately needed a legitimate path back into the family legacy. Julian nodded vigorously, practically salivating, agreeing that a chance to prove themselves was all they ever wanted. Arthur opened the thick folder. Inside were three distinct stacks of crisp white paper. He slid one stack toward Eleanor, one toward Julian, and a final stack toward Chloe. He warned them that this was not a free handout. He stated it was a binding agreement that provided financial security, but it came with strict conditions. They had to officially earn their way back. Eleanor reached for the paper with trembling hands, shouting her absolute agreement. Julian and Chloe followed instantly. They did not read the documents. They did not even glance at the headers or the fine print. They saw the official Sterling Trust logo printed clearly at the top of the pages, and their vision went completely blind with greed. They grabbed the expensive pens Arthur had placed on the table and began signing their names with a terrifying, desperate speed. They flipped page after page, signing the bottom lines rapidly. They eagerly signed away their lives, absolutely convinced they were signing the ultimate receipt for a winning lottery ticket, while Arthur watched the brilliant trap snap completely shut. As the final stroke of ink dried on the crisp white paper, Eleanor handed her stack of documents back to Arthur with a smile that was dangerously close to genuine. She truly believed she had outsmarted him. She believed her manufactured tears had successfully bypassed the security of his logical mind. Arthur smoothly gathered the 3 separate stacks of paper. He tapped them neatly against the glass surface of the coffee table. He checked the signatures carefully. They were entirely valid, legally binding, and strictly irrevocable. A cold, sharp smile finally reached Arthur's eyes. It was not a smile of reconciliation. It was the smile of a trap snapping entirely shut. Arthur stood up, walked over to the wall-mounted intercom, and pressed a single button. He spoke 2 simple words. "Bring them." The heavy wooden door to Arthur's private study opened. Victor Vance stepped into the living room. The ruthless attorney was not carrying checkbooks or pristine black credit cards. He was carrying 3 distinct bundles of coarse gray fabric wrapped tightly in clear plastic. Victor walked over to the coffee table and dropped the bundles directly next to the empty water glasses with a dull, heavy thud. Julian stared at the plastic bundles, his desperate smile faltering instantly. He asked his father what those were. Arthur picked up the legal document Eleanor had just signed. He welcomed them back to the company. He stated, his voice cutting through the room like a frozen blade, that they had just enthusiastically signed standard, entry-level employment contracts for the Sterling Logistics Distribution Center. Eleanor stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill. Arthur pointed directly to the pile of clothes. He informed Julian that he had just signed on as a Level 1 material handler. That specific role meant loading heavy pallets onto freight trucks in the freezing rain. He turned to Chloe, informing his daughter that she was officially assigned to inventory data entry deep in the concrete sub-basement. He added a crucial detail, noting that mobile phones were strictly prohibited on the warehouse floor. Finally, Arthur looked at Eleanor. He told his former wife, the woman who used to fire housekeepers for leaving a single streak on a mirror, that she was officially part of the sanitation and maintenance crew. She was assigned to the overnight shift. Eleanor stood up abruptly, her face flushing with absolute fury. She shrieked, demanding to know if this was a sick joke. She screamed that she was a society woman, not a filthy janitor. Arthur held up the signed contract. He read Clause 1 aloud. Employment was strictly at will, but the absolute acceptance and maintenance of this specific physical labor position was a mandatory, non-negotiable prerequisite for any future consideration regarding the Sterling Trust beneficiary status. Arthur reminded Eleanor that she had explicitly stated she wanted to work. She had literally begged to earn her way back. He informed them that the starting pay was exactly minimum wage, but the corporate benefits package was quite excellent after 90 days of continuous employment. He laid the contract back on the table. He told them they were completely free to leave. However, if they walked out of those elevator doors without the uniforms, they would aggressively violate the contract they had just signed, and the door to the Sterling family wealth would be permanently sealed shut forever. It was a simple offer. Take it or leave it. The agonizing silence in the penthouse was broken only by the soft chime of the private elevator doors sliding open. Megan, Julian's incredibly entitled wife, stormed into the foyer. She had grown impatient waiting in the luxurious lobby, fully expecting Julian to ride down holding a multi-million-dollar cashier's check. Megan marched into the living room, her eyes darting between the solemn faces and the gray fabric on the table. She shrieked, her voice grating against the marble walls. She demanded to know where the money was. She asked Julian why he was staring at a janitor's uniform instead of holding a reinstated trust document. Julian looked at his wife. He looked entirely broken. He whispered that his father had given them jobs so they could earn their way back. Megan let out a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed terribly. She screamed at Julian, asking if he honestly believed she had married him just to date a warehouse loader. She reminded him that she had suffered through the humiliating eviction and the disgusting motel room solely for the payout. She called Julian a pathetic loser and declared Arthur a complete psychopath. Megan turned on her expensive heels, her eyes blazing with pure hatred. She told Julian that if he touched that gray uniform, he should not bother returning to the motel. She officially declared their marriage over, marched straight back into the elevator, and let the doors seal her out of their lives forever. Julian watched his wife disappear. He did not chase her. He did not scream. He simply slumped his shoulders, the crushing weight of his poor life choices finally breaking his spine completely. He had lost his luxury cars, his sprawling mansion, his unearned pride, and now his wife. He was stripped entirely bare. His stomach let out a loud, guttural growl, betraying the severe reality of their shared situation. They had not eaten a proper, warm meal in 3 days. Arthur pointed to the gray shirt holding a name patch that read trainee. He told Julian to put on the uniform or go hungry, noting calmly that the warehouse cafeteria served hot meals with an employee discount. Julian reached out with a violently shaking hand. He picked up the heavy steel-toed boots and the gray fabric. He accepted that he was no longer a wealthy prince. He was a manual laborer. Chloe was next. She stared at the horrifying data entry contract. She cried massive, silent tears that ruined her simple dress. She realized her glamorous fake life was permanently dead. She reached out and took her uniform, accepting a miserable existence in a windowless concrete room to avoid literal starvation. Finally, there was Eleanor. She stared at the gray jumpsuit designed for the sanitation crew. She looked at Arthur, her eyes pleading one absolute last time. She whispered that they were married for 40 years, begging him not to make her scrub filthy floors on the night shift. Arthur did not blink. He reminded her that she should have saved some of the millions she recklessly spent on couture fashion. He told her she had demanded independence, and this was exactly what independence looked like for a person with zero marketable skills and zero assets. She had to work. Eleanor saw the terrifying, unyielding resolve in Arthur's eyes. She realized the luxurious penthouse, the high society galas, and the unlimited wealth were sitting right in front of her, separated by an impenetrable wall of her own making. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Eleanor reached out and picked up the gray janitorial jumpsuit. She clutched it to her chest like a tragic shroud. Arthur instructed them to report to the warehouse foreman at exactly 6 o'clock the following morning. He warned them not to be late, as the city bus schedule was notoriously unforgiving. The three of them turned and walked slowly toward the elevator, a pathetic procession of the entirely defeated, carrying the heavy gray uniforms of their brand new reality. The autumn sunlight in coastal Maine hits the ocean differently than it does anywhere else. It is a soft, golden light that seems to slow down time itself, making the afternoon stretch into an eternity of warmth and peace. Arthur Sterling sat on the wooden deck of a secluded oceanfront villa, a glass of vintage red wine in his hand, watching the gentle waves roll against the rocky shore. Evelyn was sitting across from him, reading a book aloud, her voice blending perfectly with the sound of the ocean breeze. For the very first time in 40 years, Arthur felt his shoulders completely relax. The constant, exhausting hum of anxiety, the background noise of managing a parasitic family that secretly resented him, had finally gone entirely silent. 400 miles away, deep in the concrete belly of the Sterling Logistics Distribution Center, the atmosphere was vastly different. Arthur opened his laptop, not to work, but to perform one final check. He pulled up the live security feeds. Camera 4 showed the loading dock. It was raining a cold, sleeting rain. Julian was there. He was wearing the gray uniform, now stained with grease and heavy sweat. He was wrestling with a manual pallet jack, trying desperately to move a massive skid of industrial medical supplies. He was slipping and struggling. A seasoned foreman stood nearby with a clipboard, yelling at Julian to move faster because the freight truck was leaving in exactly 10 minutes. Arthur watched his son. The arrogant sneer was completely gone, sanded away by the brutal reality of physical labor. Julian gritted his teeth, dug his heavy boots into the wet concrete, and pushed with all his might. He did not complain. He just worked. Arthur switched the feed. Camera 9 showed the windowless sub-basement. Chloe was sitting at a small metal desk, surrounded by towering stacks of ancient shipping manifests. Her job was to digitize them, keystroke by keystroke, for 10 hours a day. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail. She was not looking at a smartphone, because personal devices were strictly prohibited. She was staring at a monitor, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She had finally learned focus. She had learned that the world does not applaud you simply for existing. You have to produce actual value. He opened the final feed. The sanitation department. Eleanor was in a long hallway, wearing her gray jumpsuit, her hair covered by a net. She was pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket. She was alone. The woman who used to publicly fire maids for minor infractions was now cleaning corporate floors for minimum wage. Arthur watched her wring out the mop. She did not slouch. She did not cry. She simply did the job with a strange, grim dignity. She had hit absolute rock bottom and discovered that the bottom was solid ground. Arthur hovered his mouse over the close button. For 4 decades, he had given them millions of dollars, and they had given him only profound contempt. He had tried to buy their love and had only purchased their toxic entitlement. Now, he was giving them nothing but a harsh opportunity, and for the first time in their entire lives, they were becoming people he could almost respect. The rage that had fueled him in the courtroom had evaporated. What remained was a quiet, deep satisfaction. The ledger of his life was finally perfectly balanced. He clicked the screen closed. The image of his struggling family disappeared, replaced by the reflection of a man who was finally free. Arthur stood up and walked down to the villa garage. Waiting in the center of the room was a pristine 1968 Ford Mustang convertible, painted a deep, shining blue. It was the exact car he had always wanted, the car Eleanor had strictly forbidden him from buying because she deemed it beneath their elite social class. Evelyn walked into the garage, wearing a warm scarf and a bright smile. She climbed into the passenger seat without a single complaint. Arthur slid behind the wooden steering wheel, turned the key, and let the powerful engine roar to life. He drove the classic car out onto the winding coastal highway. The road ahead was open, the autumn air was crisp, and Arthur Sterling was finally in complete control of his own destination, leaving the heavy ghosts of his past far behind. The most expensive lesson of Arthur Sterling's life was not taught in an elite business school or a corporate boardroom. It was learned in the painful silence of his own home. For 40 years, he confused providing with parenting. He thought writing massive checks was a valid language of love, but he ultimately discovered it was merely a transaction that purchased their entitlement and guaranteed his own erasure. True legacy is never about the millions of dollars you leave behind in a trust fund. It is about the strong character you forge in the fires of necessity and hard work. Arthur learned that you cannot save people from themselves by constantly cushioning their fall. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can possibly do is let them hit the concrete so they can finally learn exactly how to stand up on their own 2 feet. True freedom is not about having enough money to do nothing. It is about having enough self-respect to demand what you actually deserve. If you believe that respect is a currency that must be actively earned, Please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to listen to many more attractive and dramatic stories every single day. How do you feel about Arthur's final decision? Do you see reflections of this story in your own real life? We truly want to hear your thoughts and feelings from the bottom of your heart, so please leave a comment down below to share your unique perspective. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful daily life, and endless peace in your hearts. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.